Summary of the Selfish Gene by Richard Dawkins. The story of the selfish gene is told by its author, Richard Dawkins. He is of the opinion that genes, and not species, are the ones that undergo evolution. Likewise, he believes there is no gene for selflessness, which means being kind or not caring about yourself. He thinks this is a very extreme point of view because it means that people are like lumbering robots whose genes have trained them to help the genes stay alive. In his mind, this is as strange as science fiction, but it's true. For the general reader, he has avoided using technical language, the scientific expert, who might see something in his story that they missed in their more technical way of looking at things, and the student, who might find the book helpful for breaking down technical theories into everyday language. Dawkins says this in the preface to the second edition of The Selfish Gene. The first thing Dawkins says in Why Are People? Is that Charles Darwin's book on the origin of species was the first clear explanation of why we are here, or why we exist. Evolutionists say that the different kinds of life in the world exist because the natural world got more complicated over time by small changes in how living things interacted with their surroundings. Organisms were fighting for limited resources, like food. The ones that were best suited to their surroundings won and lived to reproduce, passing on their traits to the next generation. The name for this process is natural selection. That's another name for it, survival of the fittest. Dawkins, on the other hand, believes that natural selection changes genes, not species. This is what he thinks Darwin would have thought if he had lived long enough to learn about genes. Dawkins chooses to use the genes perspective to explain his point of view. In his first book, Dawkins talks about the beginning of time, when the world was simplicity. This is how he starts the second part, called replicators. He says that the ancestors of our genes were made by mistake when the first atoms stuck together to form molecules that could copy themselves by getting other atoms to link in the same ways. These molecules were the first ones that could copy. Replicators sometimes make copies that are a little off. This caused many replicators to appear and start fighting for atoms. This made it possible for evolution to happen. In the next two chapters, Immortal Coils and the Gene Machine, Dawkins says that all living things, from single cells to people, are really survival machines that are made by genes to keep them safe, or to keep other replicators from stealing their atoms. That is, animals live because they pass on genes, which are copies of themselves, from one generation to the next. It's possible that this process could go on forever, which means that genes are technically ageless. In the next 6 parts, Dawkins talks about how greed and kindness work in nature. First, Dawkins talks about animal violence in a chapter that is appropriately named Aggression. Apparently, he believes that animals are not really being kind when they don't attack. Instead, those actions make it more likely for the animal to live and reproduce, which keeps its genes in the gene pool. A small animal probably won't win a fight with a big attacker, so its natural instinct to run away when it sees a big one will keep it alive. When that small animal has babies, its instinct to run away instead of fight will be passed on to the next generation. Dawkins then talks about how family members can work together and fight with each other in parts called genesmanship, family planning, and battle of the generations. He says that animals are mostly nice to their cousins, but sometimes they are mean, because they share genes. When kin work together, there are more shared genes in the gene pool as a whole. A bird helping to keep his own genes alive, for instance, when he shares his food with his younger brother. The genes in question are found in his brother. Going the nasty route to protect your own genes can pay off sometimes. If you're nice to your family, though, it can pay off because it keeps those genes in their bodies. Dawkins uses the work of many other experts to make the case that the degree to which family members are willing to help each other is roughly linked to how closely they are genetically related. In this way, all the kind things family members do for each other are really just selfish genes working behind the scenes to make sure they stay alive. Dawkins says over and over that genes aren't choosing to be selfish because genes aren't aware of it. Instead, genes tell cells how to build embryos. For example, make an embryo with long legs, this helps animals run faster and get away from predators, or make an embryo that will chirp when there's food nearby. This helps a chick's genetic cousins that live nearby. These personality traits are a guess. They happen because genes move around randomly on chromosomes in sex cells. The gene for that trait will be passed on if the organism lives long enough to reproduce because of the new behaviors. The next two parts, Battle of the Sexes and You Scratch My Back, I'll Ride on Yours, are about mating, sex ratios, social animals like ants and bees, and how people who are not related to each other can work together. In each case, Dawkins tries to show that traits in behavior exist in nature because they allow genes to be passed down from one generation to the next. For example, Dawkins uses the made-up situation known as the prisoner's dilemma from the field of game theory to show that when two people interact, those who survive to reproduce will help each other out at first, but won't do so again if they aren't thanked. These words show that people work together because it helps them stay alive, which is a selfish reason. Group selectionists have different ideas about all of the traits Dawkins talks about in these 6 parts. People who believe in group selection think that birds that pick bugs off each other's backs and kamikaze bees that die when they hit are examples of animals that act in a way that helps the group as a whole survive. In order to disprove this view, Dawkins needs to show that all behavior that seems kind is actually selfish when seen from the gene's eye view. Following this, Dawkins changes topics and writes about society in his next chapter, Memes, the New Replicators. He believes that people are unique compared to most other living things on Earth because of 2 types of evolution that have changed the way people act. As with all living things, the first is DNA development. The second is the change in culture. In Dawkins's view, cultural change happens through memes. It's possible for ideas, songs, pictures, and fashion trends to become memes and spread through a culture once they become popular. Memes start out as single thoughts in different people's minds. It's a race between memes to be remembered and shared. The fact that our brains can only hold so much information sets the stage for development. In this type of evolution, the meme is what makes copies of itself. Genes and memes are not the same because memes change a lot faster than genes do. This is why it would be hard for someone learning English now to understand what Geoffrey Chaucer wrote. He wrote in English in the 1400s. Dawkins believes that the idea of kindness comes from a meme, not a gene. In his second-to-last chapter, Nice Guys Finish First, Dawkins goes back to the subject of working together to learn more about it. His view is that all kinds of planned interactions in nature are like the prisoner's dilemma. To make his point clear again, mutual kindness, or being nice, only happens when it helps a gene stay alive. In the last part of The Selfish Gene, called The Long Reach of the Gene, Dawkins recaps his points from a different book he wrote called The Extended Phenotype. Dawkins believes that genes arrange themselves into groups called colonies or cartels that live in separate bodies. This is because working together is better for their survival. He also believes that genes are passed down through sexual reproduction, which he calls the bottleneck process. This is because evolution is easier when each generation starts from a single cell. If that one cell has a gene that has been changed, it will immediately spread to all the other cells in that area. He says it's not a surprise that scientists were confused at first. While they were looking around, they saw organisms that reproduce, so they thought that either organisms or types of organisms were changing. However, Dawkins says that the limits of an individual are not so clear-cut when you think about it. When a parasite's genes change the body of its host, this is an example of how genes can change how other organisms behave. Some genes change how things behave in the world as a whole. This happens when living things change their surroundings to improve their chances of life, like when they build walls or nests. Each of these is a genetic effect in Dawkins's eyes. He thinks that we talk about how people change based on their circumstances too much, when we should be talking about how genes change based on how they affect phenotypes. At the end of The Selfish Gene, Dawkins writes an epilogue to the 40th anniversary edition. He says that he hasn't just been telling a story about genes in the end. Besides that, he told a story about clones. There are many stories like his one about genes in nature that show how replicators change over time. Another generator that changes is his story about memes in a culture. There are probably a lot more stories to tell. That being said, he is sure that every story about evolution, even ones that take place on other worlds, is really a story about a copier. Finally, Dawkins says that genes are basically eternal. So, the past of life on Earth is written in our DNA code and needs to be read. He wants to know what we could find out about dinosaurs or how the world came to be if we started to figure out what our genes say. Dawkins says he might work on that next and share his thoughts when the 50th anniversary version of The Selfish Gene comes out.
About the author. Richard Dawkins is an evolutionary scientist and ethologist from Britain. He was born in Nairobi, Kenya, on March 26, 1941. At the time, it was a British colony called Kenya. As a child, Dawkins believed in God because he thought that the natural world was so complicated and varied that it had to have been made by a greater power or intelligence. But when Dawkins was a teenager, he became a devout atheist because he thought evolution explained the variety of life in the natural world better than faith did. Dawkins studied biology at Balliol College, Oxford, and then worked as a graduate student for Nicolaas Tinbergen, an ethologist who won the Nobel Prize and was one of the first people to study animal behavior. Dawkins' graduate work was mostly about trying to figure out how animals decide what to do. After releasing The Selfish Gene in 1976, he became famous all over the world. This book popularized the gene-centered view of evolution, which says that animals act in ways that help keep and pass on their genes. There were many changes in evolutionary biology because of this book, and it led to the creation of many new areas of study. After that, in 1982, Dawkins wrote The Extended Phenotype, in which he claims that genes change not only the bodies of living things but also the whole world. Dawkins has also spoken out against faith, both in the classroom and in politics. His strongest thoughts on this subject came out in his books The Blind Watchmaker, 1986, and The God Delusion, 2006.
Hope we summarized it fully and you liked it. Please hit the like button and subscribe to our channel so that we are motivated to create more videos.